Thanks for joining me, everyone. Charles Moscowitz here every afternoon, 12 noon. And my guest is Tim Snowball. He's with the Pacific Legal Foundation. Tim, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right, Tim, you've written an article that was published in The Hill. Socialism is neither a fair nor, quote, progressive political philosophy. Now, it's ironic that socialism is being embraced by a lot of young people in this country today. It was rejected by our founding fathers. It's the oldest philosophy known to man, goes back to the days of the Garden of Eden, in my opinion. I think Whittaker Chambers talked about this in his book Witness.
Hmm.
And the idea of having mob rule and an authoritarian power placed in the hand of the majority is the essence of it, and yet young people are embracing it left and right. Um, what's going on here, Tim? Do you think? I mean, please.
Yeah, no, please, yeah, no, it's an interesting point that you make. I mean, because I'm 35 years old, right? And so even I am a little, little too young to really remember the Cold War, right? I was a kid. I remember vaguely the Berlin Wall coming down and kind of people talking about Russia as a kid and communism and socialism. But even for me, it kind of seems like a distant memory. So you can see how kids who are in their 20s or who are, in college now, how they really just don't get it. I think a lot of the responsibility that's been shirked probably falls upon the shoulders of the professors. I mean, the professors know, at least those who are well acquainted with history would know, that socialism has never worked in a pure form when they've actually tried it in practice. I mean, Karl Marx may have been a great fiction writer, right? But most of what he wrote down in his books has not come to pass, and so it's a strange phenomenon. I go to a lot of college campuses, I speak to a lot of students, and when I speak to them, I get the sense that, as you mentioned, they don't mean socialism, the actual, political science sense or sense of the 20th century. They're actually talking about something that's quite different, that's become kind of this trendy catch-all for, desirable policies on the left. This is hashtag socialism by AOC and others, and it doesn't bear much resemblance to socialism in the classical sense, but I still do think it is a dangerous trend that we should be trying to remedy.
Well, first of all, you're right that they don't remember the old Soviet Union. They certainly are too young to remember the socialist experiment that was Nazi Germany.
Mm,
They don't realize what life was like in these socialist hellholes that were
right.
held up as utopian paradises in their day, and that were supported at various times by the international left. And they certainly don't know what life is like in Venezuela today, as you point out in your
Mm,
article. I mean, I
hmm
don't think any of these kids would survive 5 minutes in Venezuela without their bourgeois
mm,
parents' trust funds.
mm.
Um,
Yeah,
and, and yet there they are. So we need to address not the reality of socialism, which is very easy to present, but what is it emotionally about this that is appealing to young people to the point where they're willing to go out and vote for avowed socialists like Bernie Sanders and less open socialists
mm,
like the rest of the most of the other Democrats running for president
hmm
and
yeah,
people like
yeah.
AOC and all of the rest.
I think you hit the nail on the head, in your opening portion when you were talking about American values, right? And so I think it really comes down to an inversion of values. I mean, there were core ideas, as you know, upon which our country was founded. The rule of law, constitutionally limited government, and of course, the dignity and respect for the rights of the individual, inviolable rights of the individual. And so when it comes down to it, I think that when I speak to socialists or I listen to their rhetoric, right, it comes down to a prioritization of equality. They have this idea of equality, and that somehow, if we're not all, perfectly materially equal, that somehow there's been some injustice there. Somehow someone has done wrong. This idea of a fixed pie, right? That if I somehow benefit or I somehow make a profit, I must necessarily be taking that away from somebody. And that's not how basic economics works, right? I mean, when we
No.
talk about when we talk about basic productivity, You look at a Bill Gates, you look at a Mark Zuckerberg. I mean, these individuals have added so much value to society. I mean, roll back the clock and think of what business was like before something as basic now as Windows, right? Or instant messaging, or all of these other features that we look at that we take for granted now that have added trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars to the economy. And so you look at that, and from that perspective, I mean, I wish there were more millionaires walking around, right?
Of
Because
course, they create.
that signals to me that they have been productive, they have added value to society through voluntary exchanges, and that everyone else has been made better off. I think part of the problem, of course, like we mentioned, is a failure of education. The famed economist, Frederick Bastiat would always talk about the seen versus the unseen. That was one of his famous insights, right? And so the seen, of course, that people might hearken to when they're talking to socialists or about socialism is, oh, look, we've got there are poor people, poor people exist, right? That's the scene, right? What they don't see, and what economists have to search for. Economists are kind of like social scientific detectives, right? Is the United States still has an amazing social mobility. You know what I mean? You can still start out at the bottom quintile in terms of the economic ladder and still reach the top quintile. We have one of the most mobile societies still when it comes to economic betterment. And so that's something that you have to dig a little deeper into that I don't think a lot of these students, I'm sure they're capable of doing so, but that's not trendy. It's not, as you mentioned, an emotional
It's not
thing.
exciting.
Yeah.
It's more difficult to think of yourself as an individual who has to work and invent yourself and go out and accomplish something and be somebody. It's much easier and much more fashionable to just sort of log into some sort of a group think that gives you a vague sense of social acceptance, which they crave,
Right.
and which is why every socialist movement, whether it be the Nazi socialist movement or the communist movement, it draws from young people. I mean, there's
Mm,
big college movements. The Nazis drew from, teenagers and
mm,
youth, and that was the base. And the same thing with the communist movement. And you bring up this idea of scarcity, that somehow this is something that I think Karl Marx embraced, based on materialism, and this idea of that there's only a limited resource, and that money is actually a commodity, which it's not.
mm,
It's an abstract value. And it negates the fact that, as you say, somebody like a Bill Gates or someone, they invented something or they put something together out of nothing and they created money. Money
mhm.
didn't, it's not, if somebody has X number of dollars here, that doesn't mean they're taking it away from you. It means that they created it and that money's infinite. It's as
Hmm.
infinite as the human imagination. So the result is that the dot-com explosion of the 1990s, the telecom explosion, these were situations where, as a byproduct, money was created out of nothing because of
Mm.
invention, because of the culture, because of the need, an idea put into practice. So we should celebrate the fact that these industries not only created billionaires, but they created jobs on all levels for
Yes.
people at all levels of skill, and they
Yeah.
expanded our economy and our opportunity in this country and around the world. So, they're into this idea of that resources are limited and therefore they have to be divided, and it's a false idea. It's just demonstrably untrue.
Yeah, and I think you make a great point, which is that people on the right have kind of almost given up the idea that we can make a moral case for capitalism, a moral case for entrepreneurship, and kind of said, oh, well, we're going to focus on kind of the facts and the figures, and we'll let the left kind of have this narrative of the morality of it. I don't think that's true at all. I think that, when you look at American history, what you see are scores of individuals coming to our shores looking for opportunity because they know that this is a country where you can start with nothing and you can put in the effort and you can add something of value, whether it's opening a small business or finding a position with a company where you can expand or any of these other things, or being an entrepreneur who starts from scratch and discovers the next brilliant leap forward. That's possible here. And they were fleeing from exactly the kind of systems that people would like to put in place here now. And that it goes up until the present day. I have many friends, you know what I mean, who their parents were from other countries, who ultimately immigrated here, or who themselves started out somewhere else and made their way here. And they say, when people think about the United States in terms of opportunity, that's how they still think of it in the classical sense of there are opportunities that we don't have back home wherever they are, that we can come here to the United States and have these opportunities. And it's really a legacy I think that we should cherish, and we should work to kind of argue that, there's been no system thus far implemented or discovered in all of human history that can hold a candle to free market entrepreneurial capitalism, to quote Milton Friedman, right?
Right.
And so it is absolutely a fact of nature that we are sitting now upon material wealth that people 200 years ago would look at us like we're kings or something, right? There's never been greater access to goods and services, to healthcare, to education, to equal rights, or the rule of law. And so a lot of times I think hand in hand with the more soft socialist approach are these doomsday proclamations, right? Of, oh my goodness, things are just horrible, right? And when you really think about it, I mean, there's always going to be work to improve, right? I mean, human nature is
Mm-hmm.
always, I think, going to be, an imperfect human nature. So our institutions and our society will reflect upon ourselves. But so there'll always be work to be done. But at the same time, I think we can fully recognize things are going very well right now. And, that's why I have to turn off the network news and not not
Mm-hmm.
pay attention to some of this negativity, because they're in the
Oh, I mean,
business of delivering bad news.
we're in the middle of probably the biggest period of growth in American history. I mean, certainly since World War II. And when it comes down to it, to get back to what we're talking about here, capitalism, free market, these things are not ideologies. They are a reflection of human nature. We
Mm,
all want to own that which we own. We want to trade in goods and services with each other. We want to have property. I mean, property, the animal kingdom understands property.
mhm.
Try to invade the property of a dog and see what happens, right? These are natural, they're kind of baked in. We want to set up organizations based upon, like governments, to protect our natural rights, and associations. We're social beings. These things are all natural. But the socialist enterprise is an ideology. In a way, it's a religion. It
Mm,
gives a person this sense of gratification and connectedness with other people, where they don't have to do a lot of heavy lifting. I mean, it's kind of, you're immediately accepted as one of the beautiful people when you
mm,
when you join this, and you have this sense of righteousness, that you're somehow doing something good, even though you don't
mm,
do anything. I mean, you're just, by being there, you must be good.
mm,
And the other aspect is that the in a way, the cardinal element of the faith is this utopianism, this messianism. You're going to
mm,
change human nature by in making the world literally, physically a better place. It's
mm,
not the same thing as Christian messianism, where you believe that a Messiah will come, or Jewish messianism. Something divine will happen because we're spiritual people, and we create a better world because we're good people. It's more like a physical thing, where you use the force of man to
mm,
change human nature by turning us into collective societies, but you give up anything that makes us unequal. You started
mm,
by talking about this really bizarre idea that you have to have absolute equality, when
mm,
that's impossible. It runs against human nature. It's we are all different. We all have different skills. We have
mm,
different circumstances, and the answer is not to create absolute equality, but to create a society where we're free to have mobility, either upward or downward, and that we don't live in this utopia. It's not a perfect world, never will be a perfect world. It's an unfair world. That's just the reality we're in. So we can make a better world by being better people, not by using the force of nature to try to literally change human nature and turn us into some kind of a beehive, or whatever they're trying to
mm.
do.
Yeah, and I think that you make a great point, which is, of course, everything that you're elaborating on. I'm sure you spent time and effort, it sounds like, studying these things,
Right.
getting a grasp upon these things. And there's a certain sense there of having to put in the effort to understand, right? And so I think when you're presented with a lot of these things as an 18-year-old kid in your first semester, at the university, it's not as easy to see that, right? I remember when I was a transfer student from a community college. I transferred into UC Berkeley to finish my undergraduate degree, and I had a friend back home who said, "Oh, they're going to have you right away probably reading Karl Marx or something." And I said, "Oh, give me a break." I said, "I'm not even taking classes where we should even touch upon Marx." Of course, I sent him a picture of myself holding a Marx reader as I was sitting on campus that first semester, because somehow the professor for that class had found a way to work Karl Marx into the curriculum, right?
Right, of
So don't,
course.
don't get me wrong. I mean, I've read Karl Marx, right? And Marx is a great fiction writer. You know what I mean? But
Hmm.
so was C.S. Lewis. And we're not trying to remake society in the image of the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? And so it is interesting because, like I mentioned before, when you look at go back through human history, when you look at how these actual policies have they played out in reality, always an abject failure, always the misery and death of millions of people, right? Every time that they've tried to implement these ideas has had to be at the barrel of a gun, right? It's always
Hmm. Of
force.
course.
Marx writes that eventually there's going to things in the system are going to reach kind of a critical mass, and that the lower class, or the working class, the proletariat as he calls them, will rise up and seize the means of production and property and redistribute it, and then there'll be this kind of equilibrium that will be reached, the tyranny of the proletariat, right? I mean, this is fantasy writing, but nothing. I mean, it seems like if you're a budding socialist, you would look at this and you would say, nothing like what Marx predicted has ever come to pass. Every time they've tried to do this, they've had to implement it through force, and it's been a failure. And
Right.
so I think one of the interesting things that touches upon what you were saying in terms of seeking a utopia, or almost a religious aspect to it, is a lot of times people I've spoken to will say, well, like those countries, they never got it right. That was never real
Yeah, it's not
socialism.
pure, right.
That wasn't pure socialism. That was, they didn't do it correctly. And if
Yeah,
we
maybe
could
we should
just
try again. Right,
right,
exactly. Let's.
if we can just get the conditions correct,
Mm.
then it'll work,
Oh,
right?
that's
And
that's so insidious. I mean, let's, we have had Holocaust, forced starvations, 100 million people killed, but we still need to try it again. And it's this. You say that every situation where socialism has been tried has involved the use of force, and that is, I think, a fact of history. It really can't be any other way because it's unnatural as a system. No one is going to rightfully, consciously give up their property or give up their right to trade goods and services, or their right to believe in God, or their right to have a family, or their right to do all of these basic functions that you'd have to give up in order to create absolute equality. So they have to use subterfuge, they have to use subversion, and they have to ultimately use violence in order to forcibly implement this system. But I want to bring it up to today because we now have this movement that really has reached a higher ground than I would ever expect it to have reached, in that you actually have people that have been elected to Congress now
mhm,
who are
mhm,
open and avowed socialists and who are talking about things like the Green New Deal. Even today, there's
mhm,
something that's burning up the world of talk radio, is that the organization that issues SAT scores is
mhm,
talking about creating an adversity score, which
mhm,
is to say, and then the parents won't even see this, where they factor into the score your socioeconomic background, your race, your ethnicity, all of these things, and you get points for that.
hmm,
And you have thus, the big Ivy League colleges, particularly apparently Princeton, that is going to consider these things when they admit students in the
hmm,
name of creating diversity. Now, I don't see that as helping anybody, whether it be the poor white family that their child achieved and became a very successful student, who may not get into that college where they
mhm,
otherwise might have because of their race, or the black child who is maybe will get into that college but is not really, in terms of academically, set up for it, and they'll either fail, or ultimately the college is going to have to lower its standards in order to keep them in there, in which case everybody loses. I
mhm,
mean, to me, they're talking about dealing with the symptoms, not the actual problem, which is how to improve education and create a means by which people can think cognitively and develop intellectually, and also how
Hmm.
to honor skills that maybe are needed for people who don't go to college. I mean,
Right.
what's wrong with apprenticeships and what's wrong with vocational skills? I mean, these things are not honored by these radical leftists who really have nothing but contempt for working people and for skilled people. I mean, it's all this kind of artificial vision of creating an absolute, equality.
Hmm. No, I very much agree with you. I mean, I myself was a high school dropout. I actually didn't finish high school, and so I found myself in a situation that I think, unfortunately, a lot of young Americans find themselves in, which is I didn't have a high school degree. I hadn't been set up, with a family. My family, no one had really gone to college, and so that wasn't something that was particularly I was guided toward, as a young man, and so I found myself in the workforce, kind of working a menial job for a number of years and had to make the decision in my mid 20s to go back to school. And it's a heck of a thing to be 27 years old writing your first paper or learning how to use the quadratic formula for the first time. But I saw firsthand a lot of times where people are being forced into a certain situation that maybe not be ideal for them or they might not be ready for. I mean, there's something you bring up that ties into to something called mismatch theory, which is this idea that if you artificially inflate test scores or you give people some kind of boost based upon socioeconomic status or their race or these other non-academic factors in order to kind of filter them into a certain academic institution because they have some kind of diversity quota or something they're trying to fill, right? And so you have students actually be put into institutions that they actually are either not qualified for or they forego other institutions where it might not be quite as prestigious, but they might actually do better. And so
Right.
this is an interesting phenomenon, right? Because when it comes down to it, I couldn't care less about a school's PR image, about how diverse they want to look, or if they have some kind of secret quota system where they're trying to fill in slots of a given, type of people into their class. I mean, that doesn't matter to me at all. I'm interested in the individual, and I want to see individuals, especially those who are pursuing a higher education. I want them to be the best, the most equipped they can be in order to do well in their higher education. I mean, as someone who was a reentry student who went back to school, I understand how daunting it is and how much pressure people are under especially when they first go back to college or if they're a transfer student and all these other things. And it's a weird thing, because I often think about Martin Luther King Jr. and his famous speech, on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, where he's talking about his children, being judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And that sounds, that I think embodies this principle of equality that we have fought for as Americans for 200 years. You know what I mean? It's always been a work in progress, but the way that Dr. King describes it, I think cuts to the heart of it. That's something quite different than the type of equality that modern people on the left are pursuing today, which is this idea that not that everyone should be treated the same, but that special favors and privileges should be handed out based upon group identity. And I think
Right.
that
Right.
those are diametrically opposed ideas.
Yes, I mean that's those are forms of collectivism, and America has always been a nation of individuals and small business owners and people who create something out of nothing. I mean that's what makes us the exceptional nation. I mean that's it's very different than the old societies where you had an aristocracy that claimed to derive its right from God. I mean we don't have that. We got rid of that
Mm-hmm.
in our revolution, and we replaced it with a nation of citizens who have equal ability to either get ahead or not, and that you know, and yet in that context, these collectivized socialists seem to be making major strides. I mean, I've mentioned this business of the SAT scores, how that is changing. That's a new trial balloon that's being put out there. You've got all these Democratic candidates talking about banning cows and banning airplanes and banning, this sort of and they, of course, they're absolutely gone off the deep end in their hatred for President Trump, which I think is entirely a reflection of their un-American views. Trump represents the businessman, the individual, putting
Mm-hmm.
aside what he actually is. I mean, the point is people represent things. Obama represented some things. I mean, Trump represents this idea that threatens the entire apple cart of what the left has been trying to build in this country for the past 100 years.
Mm.
He represents the dismantling of the administrative state, as Steve Bannon once put it. And so they're going berserk. What do you think is going to happen? I mean, in this, I know that I'm asking you to look into a crystal ball here, but what the heck, What do you think, Tim, is going to happen politically? I mean, the forces that Trump is facing are fierce. I mean, they are doing everything they can to stop him.
Mm-hmm.
What do you see coming down the pike?
Well, I think I take solace in the fact that, as far as the numbers that I've looked at, most Americans still are entirely skeptical of a lot of these socialist schemes, right? I think it's very much partisan. I think it's very much grouped on the coasts. And so I do take solace in the fact that most Americans can kind of see through, I think, this fog screen. As for the 2020 election, it's interesting because I was trained in political science as an undergrad, right? And one of the things that you first learn in political science is, what you see on the media or what you're following in the horse race, so to speak, is not always an accurate reflection of reality, right?
Right.
And so, from what I can remember from my undergraduate education is, when it comes to predicting whether or not an incumbent president or a candidate rather will be reelected, they can boil that down to three pretty discrete, straightforward criteria, right? And you know what I mean? You watch CNN and you think, oh my God, like they've got these poll numbers shifting every day. But I mean, if 2016 taught us anything, it's that a lot of this polling, whether it's through, direct malfeasance by the networks or whether it's just not accurate due to some kind of design flaw, we should not be putting all of our stock in terms of electoral predictions on polling data, right? But when you look at the political science, usually they'll say, okay, well, here's the three factors you look at to see whether a president or a candidate for the presidency will be elected. How's the economy doing? Right? In a down economy, people are much more likely to want to, switch up candidates, possibly switch parties, because, when there's not money in their pocket, when they're struggling to put food on the table, they're much more likely to opt for a change candidate. When the economy is booming like it is now, people are much more comfortable with reelecting an incumbent, right, and continuing kind of the status quo. Another one is party ID. People who generally vote a certain way, whether it's Republican or Democrat, are going to vote that way again. And so when we look at the electoral map, sure, there may be some shifting in some of the battleground states, but generally speaking, we see a certain sense of consistency. And then, as I mentioned, tied in with that economic heuristic is the incumbency advantage. People are just loath usually to hand the office over to someone else that's untested. When we have someone now who, for better or worse, we've known for 4 years, we know their style, we know their approach, and whether they have proven results. And so all of these factors that political scientists generally look at would bode well for President Trump. Now, I can't predict exactly what's going to happen, right? But I know based on this data, these measures, things look, pretty well for the president. It also doesn't bode well for the Democrats. They have something like 28 or 29 candidates now in the race. I mean, what that winds up doing is splitting up support for any one candidate. I mean, we might, for all they know, one of these backseat candidates that has 1% of the vote or less might actually be in the best position to challenge President Trump. But unfortunately, that individual, mathematically speaking, is not likely to get the nomination because once the debates start, once people start dropping out, it winds up getting forced out, and possibly you wind up with a candidate who might have the most name recognition per se, but might not be in the best position to mount a challenge. So it's going to be, as a political junkie since I was a teenager, it'll be very entertaining to watch. But as you mentioned, impossible to predict with 100% accuracy.
Right. I mean, I think that also we have to realize that President Trump is a counter-revolutionary figure. He is challenging this whole rotten left-wing move that's been going on in this country, I think, for the past probably 100 years. He speaks plainly. He doesn't use all this double talk, the language that French scholar Elaine Benescon called the totalitarian language, where everything has double, triple meaning and everything is indirect. Trump, for better or worse, speaks directly, and he speaks plainly, sometimes a little too plainly, but nevertheless, we know who he is, we know what he's thinking. And that alone is really shaking up the entire establishment. All right, Tim Snowball's my guest, Pacific Legal Foundation. Tim, talk a little bit about what you guys are doing over there at the Pacific Legal Foundation, where people can reach you, what you're working on these days, and what's coming up with you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, PLF has been around since 1973. We were founded by former members of then Governor Reagan's staff here in the Sacramento area. And we exist purely as a watchdog for constitutionally limited government. I mean, we work 100% pro bono for our clients. We don't accept any fees. And our entire purpose is really to enforce the Bill of Rights on out of control government. I mean, you talk about dismantling the regulatory state. We've been at that for decades, and it's nice to see, our efforts and the efforts of other partner organizations and others start to bear fruit. As I mentioned, we were founded here in Sacramento, but now we're a national organization with lawyers and offices all over the place. And so it's a real pleasure for me. Working at an organization like PLF was really a dream job for me. It's something to be able to come in every day and be doing work on behalf of the American people and on behalf of protecting our government from, as you mentioned, this constant sense of encroachment by out of control government. I mean, the battle, as long as there's government, the battle will probably never be won, but that doesn't mean that we won't keep up the fight and try to do our best to match every encroachment with resistance on our part, legally speaking. If you're audience is interested, you can find us online. pacificlegal.org is the website. We're also on all the social media platforms, on Twitter, on Facebook. We produce some amazing content on YouTube in regards to our clients. Our practice areas include property rights, equality before the law, taking on the administrative state, free speech, and of course, economic liberty, which is every American's right to earn an honest living free from government involvement.
All right, very good, Tim. Listen, I want to thank you for joining me. I admire your work over there, and let's stay in touch and do more programming from time to time. And thanks a lot. Have a great day.
Thank you. Happy to come back anytime.
All right, Tim.